So the next bit is really oligopoly, okay? So before I kind of talk about that, I'll give you a bit of a context and a bit of an overall of where we're kind of heading. So in the first 6 chapters, we were talking about perfect competition. And then basically in the second half of the course, we're talking about basically relaxing some of the assumptions of perfectly competitive markets. And we kind of talk about it in terms of, well, suppose that you don't have free entry and free exit, for example, and this is what oligopoly is about. And if we, for example, relax the assumption about the goods being private, that is, we talk about public goods, again, that has a different set of analysis. And this is what the second half is all about. We begin to relax these assumptions to allow you for a much richer set of tools and a much richer analysis of these markets. So the first of these was the monopoly market, okay? So a monopoly, in some sense, is the extreme of a perfectly competitive market. There's only one firm, okay? And then you guys seem to have understood how the monopoly works, that you basically choose where MR equals to MC, and most of you seem to have understood that, well, in reality, the difference is that with a monopoly, the firms are no longer facing a horizontal curve, they're facing a downward sloping demand curve, which in short suggests that if they were to reduce price, they don't lose the entire market. Okay, they have market power. So oligopoly is kind of a little bit different, right? So what we're kind of saying here is, well, there are a number of players, but their action kind of matters. So it kind of matters in the sense that it will dictate how I would behave. So you're going to say, well, give me an example of that. And the best example, which I'm sure most of you can understand, is the banks in Australia. Okay, so it's basically in Australia we have the big 4 banks, and they have something like an 80 to 90% market share. And obviously, they're big and ugly enough. And more importantly, when one bank actually undertakes a particular action, all the other banks will be watching, because it will also affect their outcomes as well. And that's the key. In a perfectly competitive market, it really never really actually mattered what the next guy did, because he could never quite influence prices. Whereas here, if, for example, CBA or ANZ or NAB decide to shift interest rates, it's going to impact all the other players. It's going to definitely affect how the consumers are going to shop for home loans, for example, right? So this is why, given this particular aspect of the problem, we needed to talk about things in terms of game theoretical setup. Okay, so this is why game theory is used, and this is also one of the first times that we show that the invisible hand can also fail in this type of setup. So you're going to say, well, what does that all mean? So hopefully you guys understood the prisoner's dilemma, right? So the story is that there are 2 prisoners, right? They can either snitch on each other, or they both remain quiet to each other about each other's crimes, okay? So if they both snitched on each other, then they would both receive basically, let's say, 20 years, right? If they both had stayed quiet, then they might receive 5 years, right? But if one snitched and one remained quiet, well, the guy snitched will be virtually almost scot-free, whereas the guy that then suffers is the guy that has been snitched on, and he gets, let's say, life imprisonment. So if you construct that particular game, what you're going to find is that there is an incentive for everyone to snitch on each other. But the interesting thing is, that's not the efficient outcome. The efficient outcome is for all of them to actually remain quiet. And that's the paradox. And this is why we say that, well, in this particular case, the invisible hand hasn't actually worked. Okay? So that was the prisoner's dilemma. A more practical example of the prisoner's dilemma is relating to cartels. right? So I will talk a little bit about that. And then we also talked a little bit about the coordination game where you had multiple equilibria.